Hello and welcome back. I told you I was going to make a video on biomes. I'm actually going to split this up into two videos. I know you're so excited. And I'm talking about terrestrial biomes and aquatic biomes. So speaking of all that, okay, you ready? What did the ocean say when it got to the shore? Nothing. It just waved. I know it's terrible, but listen, I gotta keep you entertained in some way, shape, and form, right? So I'm working on it. All right, so let's get right into talking about biomes. Something that's going to pop up that I'm just kind of skip over and gloss over is about the idea of a niche and niche stratification, or if you don't prefer French, you can also call it a niche. It's a French word, that's why it's pronounced niche usually. But a niche is basically an organism's job or role in nature. And I don't really want to talk about niche stratification when we're talking about biomes. So it's in here. I'm just going to skip right over it. Okay, so just pretend. Pretend it's not there. All right. So we've already talked about climate, and we've talked about uneven heating of the earth. Well, how does climate affect nature and locations of biomes? So climate is really the driving force that affects what plant life can exist where, and then that affects what animal life can exist where too. I'm at home, so I've got my diet green tea with ginseng and honey. Hey, wait. Did you like and subscribe to my channel yet? You should. Do it now, like this video. It's like over that way. Press it. Anyway, let's not talk about that. Let's talk about biomes. Okay. So the biomes that we're going to talk about are going to be deserts, grasslands, and forests, and they all come in three flavors: tropical, temperate, and cold. And so the temperature and the amount of precipitation determine what biome you're in, and you can literally plot this on a graph. And if someone were to give you like high temperature, low precipitation, you'd be like, that's a hot desert, a tropical desert. So if you have those kind of information, you can get a general idea of what plants exist there, and then from there you can kind of build an idea of what animal life is there, and so on and so forth. So what is a biome? Like, use that word, what is it? So when we're thinking about living things, you can organize them as organism, like a single creature, like one human, a population, so that would be all the humans in an area. For example, if we're talking about humans, or all the squirrels in this forested area, that's a population. All organisms are the same species. You can then have a community, which, if we're talking about a forest, that includes all the trees, all the ants, all the bugs, all the worms, all the bacteria, all the squirrels, hawks, every living thing in that area is part of the community. And finally, you have your ecosystem. I don't know why I couldn't think of a word. I need a video editor. So you have your ecosystem, and your ecosystem is made up of the living and non-living parts of that area. And a biome is like basically an ecosystem scaled up over a very, very large area. So, for example, the area we live in is a temperate forest, but you can find grassland areas in our region. If you travel west through our state, you'll end up finding mountains and mountainous regions. You'll have an alpine climate and biome. So, still the prevailing biome, I guess you'd call it, over our area, over the east coast of the United States, is a temperate forest. So it's like an ecosystem on a very large scale. It's not uniform, like I was saying. You can have different patches of things depending on where you're going. And biologists love to use the word mosaic because, yes, we think we're fancy. But like a mosaic is a painting or a picture. You can think of it like a stained glass window. Maybe it's something you're more familiar with, that's got like a bunch of little pieces that come together to make a big picture. Like I said, precipitation, so rainfall, snowfall, sleet, and temperature are going to determine the overall biome. And latitude and elevation or altitude actually play also a critical role. as you increase in latitude going from the equator to the poles, you're going to see this change because you're going to see the change in temperature from being a tropical to temperate to polar. As you go up altitude or elevation in a mountain, you'll also see this sort of change where we go from having a like potentially tropical or temperate to this tundra, which we call alpine when we're talking about going up a mountain. So here are major biomes. You can see like, yeah, there's definitely similarities as you go across lines of latitude, going up from the equator or going down from the equator in the opposite way, because it's kind of just the same, just upside down in the southern hemisphere. And we talked before about how, okay, well, we're going to see this uneven heating. We're going to see hot air at the equator, of course, and it's going to be hot, moist air because of those Hadley cells that are those convection currents that are circulating that are going to bring that warm, moist air and just capture that moisture and rain out, which is why here at the equator we see our rainforest. Okay, that biome is characterized by very, very, very hot and lots of precipitation. If you go up and you look at the tropics, like the Tropic of Cancer, and then down here the Tropic of Capricorn, remember that's where the Hadley and Ferrel cells meet. And so what is that going to bring? The air that those cells bring together is cool and dry. And so you're not going to see a lot of moisture. So that's why you see deserts, and then 30 degrees south, deserts. There's other factors that lead into why an area is a desert. For example, in the American Southwest, part of it's in the rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains. So that's going to add to it. But these are the major biomes kind of mapped out. You can see that there's a pattern to them. But just because there's a pattern doesn't mean it's always going to be exactly perfect. Here's us. Probably we live here. So I don't care what anyone says. I grew up right here. Don't you tell me this temperate deciduous forest is the same as this temperate deciduous forest. I live there. And you want to talk about a mosaic, that was like tundra, like half the year. So anyway, like I said before, you can kind of look right here at our desert. And we talked about winds and the kind of things that go along with geography. So here in California, you see it's raining. You have this might actually be better called a temperate rainforest on this side of the country. But this side is in a rain shadow. Remember, it's the leeward side of the Rocky Mountains, so they're not going to get as much rainfall, and you're going to have a desert here. And then the center of our country is certainly a grassland. Very flat, very grassy, good for farms. And this is what I was talking about with altitude and latitude. As you go from the equator to the poles, let's just use this as the northern hemisphere, for example, you're going to see this shift in biomes from this tropical forest to a temperate forest, and a coniferous forest, tundra, taiga, and then the poles. Now, is it going to be perfect like that? No, we just saw a picture of the United States where that's clearly not the case. However, you can see that there is a change, or as you go up, there's clearly a change from a tropical to a more polar. Well, it's the same thing as you increase in elevation or altitude. I like to think latitude, altitude, because, I don't know, they sound cool. I don't know. But as you go up a mountain, as you increase in elevation, you also see this change where you go from like a forest of some kind to maybe like more pine trees, to this point where, like in the tundra, you don't see, you're past the tree line. Trees aren't going to grow here anymore. And then you're going to clearly see something that resembles a polar type climate. Sorry that I had that like 8 times. Okay, so I can show you guys, I'll show you in class a graph to illustrate where the different biomes are. But here we have this kind of 3D effect graph here. So here's our high temperature, here's our cold temperature. What's nice about this is you can imagine this being the northern hemisphere. So here's our pole. It's not exactly perfect like that, but you can imagine that. And here we have very, very wet, and then where my head is walking, we have very, very dry. And here it says tropical desert, by the way. So you can think of this as a graph. So if we're very, very hot with high precipitation, you're in this tropical rainforest. If you're hot but very dry, it's a desert. If you're somewhere in the middle but still really wet, you have this forest area, which, like in Washington, Oregon, could even be considered a temperate rainforest with how much rain they get. And then sort of literally in the middle of all this is this thing called chaparral. We'll get to what that is. We won't talk about it yet. I don't want to get ahead of myself. So one thing that you'll notice is the biodiversity of plant species changes as you go up or down in latitude. Okay, so you're increasing latitude from 0 to 90, or in this case 0 to 90 south. We have the largest amount of biodiversity in our rainforest areas. That's why these areas are so crucial and need to be protected. The higher the biodiversity, the healthier the ecosystem. And we rely on a lot of these plants and animals for medicines and other things. So that's why burning of the rainforest and changing it to a monoculture, a farm, or a grassland for grazing is so bad. Don't stop that. Don't do that. So let's just get started talking about these biomes. Terrestrial biomes, I'll do another video on aquatic biomes. So let's start with deserts. There's 3 types of deserts. 3. I'm going to be like my child. 3. Anyway, tropical, temperate, and cold deserts. And the thing about deserts is they're very fragile ecosystems. You have very slow plant growth. They're going to take instant advantage of any major rainfall by producing a multitude of seeds and rushing to reproduce, blooming and producing flowers as quickly as possible, and then becoming pretty much dormant. There's low species diversity. Not a whole lot of things have adaptations that allow them to survive in this kind of climate. And in fact, in some deserts, the temperature change just in a day is extreme. And there's not a whole lot of creatures that can deal with those kinds of extremes. So nutrient recycling, which we're going to talk about this week, get excited, put it on your calendars, is slower in deserts. And they're characterized by a lack of water. I'm sure you're at that last part, you're like, yeah, I know. All right, so let's look at these graphs. So here, probably when you think of desert, you probably think of something like this, like the Sahara Desert. Always very hot. The mean monthly temperature never hits freezing ever, and extremely dry. So what could you see here? Like this scrub grass, there's not a whole lot of life hanging out here. Okay, not a lot of things can deal with that extreme high temperatures and extreme low amount of water. So you'll see things like bunch grasses. When you think of desert, you might also think of something like this, like the saguaro in the American Southwest. That's a temperate desert. And so a little bit different. You can get freezing temperatures. In fact, the temperature swing in a day can also be very great. So plants and animals have to deal with extremely hot temperature and cold temperature. So still very low water. Okay, so let's actually take a minute to look at and appreciate these graphs. Okay, because one goal that you should have for yourself is to get good at interpreting graphs and just looking at them and being able to see. Sometimes I forget that I've done that a million times and you guys haven't. So let's take a quick look. So here we have on our y-axis, we actually have 2 different y-axes going on here, one on the left and one on the right. I lied, let's look at the x-axis. This is just the months of the year. So this is time at the bottom. Here we have monthly mean temperature in degrees Celsius because we're in science. Of course we're going to use degrees Celsius. That's all there is. I don't know what Fahrenheit is. And here would be freezing. It never gets below freezing. So this red line represents temperature. So to look at the temperature, I'm going to look at the left side here and to see what the temperature is if I want to just put my finger on it and move it over. On this side, we have mean monthly precipitation. Why is it so mean? Anyway, it's in millimeters, so very, very small amount, 50 millimeters. That's like 5 centimeters. That's not that much. So here, this blue part illustrates the monthly rainfall. So you can see for a good portion of the year, it doesn't even get picked up. There might be nothing. So now that you have an idea of how to look at these graphs, they'll pop up for each one. And then we have our cold deserts. And so a good example of this is the Atacama Desert in South America, in Peru, for example. And these can get freezing in the winter, still very, very little rainfall. And the summer can get very, very hot. So here's like some creatures that would live in like our desert in the United States, in the American Southwest. So just take a look, see what you can get out of it. We're not really going to totally talk about animals and plants like in great detail because we're just talking about the characteristics of the biome. Although the creatures that live in it are part of the characteristics. That's a good point. Okay, so let's then take a minute, since the living things are part of the biome. And one of the living things, clearly, are the plants. So plants, and what plant life can exist, is determined by temperature and precipitation. So each biome is going to have unique plant life because that's what can survive there. So we see these succulent plants like cactuses and agave with a waxy, thick cuticle to keep water in. Wax is sort of like a waterproofer. And they have these thick, we call them succulent leaves that store water. Now just take a look at the animals that live here. Look at the coloration on some of these. Don't you think that would blend in really well in this sort of area that maybe if you were flying over, you might not see this? It might blend right in with these, like, with this sand and rock that's here. Another thing is, if you look at something like the jackrabbit, they have very long ears. If you saw a picture of them, you'd see the ears. You can clearly see the arteries and veins that are in there. And that helps to dissipate heat. Same thing with their long limbs, help to draw heat away from their body. You can see that with this little kangaroo rat. You know, I gotta double look this up. But I heard somewhere that they don't even need to really drink water, that they get all the water they need from the seeds and plants that they eat. And when they pee, they don't actually pee any sort of liquid. It comes out as like sort of like a crystal. Now, I remember learning this a long time ago. I'm not going to say how long because I don't want you to know how old I am. Old. So I gotta fact check myself. You can fact check me and let me know. So just to give you an idea about how difficult it is to survive in the desert, animals that are adapted to live here, they are designed to beat the heat, like I kind of told you, in many different types of ways, and to make every single drop of water count because it's so rare in these deserts that it rains. So when they come in contact with water, they have to already have something that allows them to make efficient use of it. So like I said, plant adaptations, you can find these succulent plants with thick leaves like a cactus or like agave or like an aloe plant, and they'll have very, very deep tap roots that hopefully will go all the way down and find some of that groundwater. Let's connect this back to what we talked about with soils and what we talked about with water, right? Okay, so in deserts, what kind of soil do we have? Sandy soil. And what happens to water as it passes through sandy soil? Well, that's going to infiltrate very, very, very quickly and go to a deep layer, maybe where all of a sudden there's like a cap of clay or something, and it kind of gets stuck there as groundwater. So these plants in the desert have to have a very deep root to hopefully reach down into that sort of groundwater that hopefully is there. Animals, we talked about some of their physiology, some of their anatomy just a minute ago, how they're more adapted for desert life. And then about their behavior, here's something interesting called estivation. It's sort of like the opposite of hibernation. So when animals estivate, they bury themselves or will kind of go into their burrow in the hottest times of the day or during the summer and kind of be mostly inactive because it is too hot. Kind of like how a bear would hibernate because it's a little cold. Another behavior is being nocturnal. Maybe it's just too hot in the desert most of the time for them to do anything. And so they're going to be active at night instead of during the day. And here, like I said, here's some wildflowers blooming in the desert, trying to make use of that water that just happen. So if it just rained, they're going to try to produce as many seeds as possible in hopes that some of them survive. Guess how many types of grasslands there are? 3. Tropical, temperate, and cold, or polar, which we call the tundra. So let's take a look at them. So our tropical grassland is often called savanna. You can see it's mostly grasses. I'm sure you're probably familiar with a lot of savanna animals. Not lots of trees because it's a grassland. But you can see we have more rainfall than in a desert, clearly. Here's a temperate grassland, kind of like the ones that you could find in central United States, like in Kansas. Tons and tons of wildflowers and stuff, a grassland. And then you can have a cold grassland, that's tundra. I swear I feel like I lived here. No, it's a temperate forest. Okay. You lived there for years and tell me it's not the tundra. Okay, maybe it didn't get to like negative 30 Celsius in the winter, but it really felt like it sometimes. And look here, there's not tons of rainfall, certainly more than a desert, but not much. Why is that? Let's go back and think about like what we talked about with air and moisture. Cold air can't hold as much moisture as warm air. Like this is like, my warm air can clearly hold more. And if I had like a little baby cup, of course I don't have one right with me because I wasn't planning on talking about that. Yeah, this would overflow that cup because there's just not that much space. So cold air, you can think of it as like a tiny little cup that can't hold that much air. And warm air is like a bigger cup. It can hold more moisture, which is why you can have rainier areas where it's hotter and you don't get as much rain and precipitation where it's cold. So what are some characteristics of these different grasslands? In a savanna, you find grazing and browsing animals. Like, they're just kind of, do I want that? No. How about no? Anyway, sorry. And what about a temperate grassland? Well, there you have cold winters and hot, dry summers. You can have tall grass and short grass prairies. So think of like prairie land, like Badlands National Park. I'll link a video on Classroom for Badlands National Park. I want to visit there. It's very beautiful looking. So I think of like prairie dogs. And it's often converted to farmland, which seems like a great idea. But I want to talk to you for a minute about why that's not a great idea. So let's take a look here. So we saw with that grassland, now we can see in this picture, that you have a lot of diversity, like a lot of biodiversity. There's lots of different animals and plant species. And when we turn that area into a farm, we call that a monoculture, like if we're planting wheat or corn. So we wiped out all the biodiversity that was in that area. You might say, well, I didn't kill everything. There's still stuff there. That's true. But when we cut up and fragment these ecosystems, we actually significantly decrease the habitat space for these creatures. And then what else do we do with farms? Like we spray pesticides to kill all the bugs and try to keep the birds off of it. So it does seem like a good idea to put a farm there, but what's the answer? I don't know. I mean, we need farms, we need to eat, people need to eat, but we also need the earth. So I don't know what the right answer is. I don't think I can tell you. I think we just need to have a sustainable farming revolution. I'm not smart enough to come up with that. It's taken me a long time to realize that I don't know anything. And I have no idea how to do that or how to begin doing that, but you could. And when you do something super smart like that, just think of me. And when you're like a multi-billionaire, just kind of think back and be like, oh yeah, my teacher gave me that idea. She's great. I don't need millions, okay? Anyway, so just like we looked at with the desert, you can kind of see some different creatures here in a tall grass prairie. Prairie dogs, they're like the keystone species here in a tall grass prairie, and we'll talk about that in another time. What's a keystone species? Why the prairie dog? Well, we can talk about that another time. But you can see that there's not those thick succulent leaves and that waxy cuticle. There's not adaptations to deal with extreme drought. But you have animals that will make prairie dog towns like burrows and have thicker fur to deal with cold. So this kind of pushes into another idea, the idea of limiting factors. So each biome has a different limiting factor that would characterize it, or you can kind of shrink that down to each like ecosystem, or each even I almost said microclimate, but even like each little micro ecosystem that's in an area. Each one deals with its own limiting factor, and sometimes it's like what characterizes the biome. For example, like the limiting factor in a desert is water. But these creatures are all designed to work within those constraints. Like they just have adaptations that fit. So if another creature was brought into this area and it was like a desert creature and it's great at like surviving when there's no water, well, as soon as the first cold hits, it might die because it's not adapted for that. Just kind of throwing those ideas out there to get that kind of swirling in your mind. What about tundra? No thanks. But it's also a fragile biome like a desert. Plants grow very close to the ground to conserve heat because it is so cold. So you'd see more like lichens and mosses and maybe even non-vascular plants in some cases. But you won't see trees. So kind of thinking about going up a mountain, like alpine tundra, it's above the tree line. So we don't really see like tall trees here. We see lots of like short, small grasses. Most of the growth happens in a very short summer. Animals that live there have a really thick coat to deal with the winter. And it's also characterized by this thing called permafrost. So that's like permanently frozen ground. So when we talk about more into like human impact on this, as time has gone on, more and more of this permafrost is starting to melt and not be permanently frosted anymore. And we can get into why that's bad. Okay, I personally would love it. I don't like the cold, but that doesn't matter. We need that. Okay, but what is permafrost? Water has seeped into this ground and it's permanently frozen. Okay, so that's the water in the soil stays frozen year round. And we talked about that. So now, what about in that middle area? Well, we have woodland shrubland or temperate shrubland, also known as chaparral. This is what people think of as like the ideal climate. So it's like that Mediterranean climate. This is what you see in Southern California. This is what you see in a couple spots in Australia near the coast. It's usually found near the sea. It's got a nice climate. It doesn't get super, super hot in the summer. Never gets really cold. But what's going on right now? These areas are prone to fire in dry seasons. So that's why it can be a little risky. So let's kind of talk about something neat when we're talking about adaptations. Fire and forest fires are not a bad thing. Okay. Humans being around all these fires and potentially like losing their homes and dying, yes, that is a bad thing. It's a bad thing for them, and we should care and we should try to make sure nobody is hurt or has to deal with stuff like that, so on, so on, so on. But let's take humans out of this. Let's just talk about the forest. If there were no humans, forest fires would still happen. Sometimes things get hot and like the conditions are right, and dry brush can spark up. Lightning could happen and spark up a fire in a forest. And those things happen. And yes, plants and animals will die. And to us, yeah, that's bad, but those things happen. So it just sort of is. It's not like a good thing or a bad thing. It's just something that happens. But here's something interesting. Because fires do happen, some plants produce seeds that are adapted in such a way that they won't germinate, which means sprout or grow, until they're exposed to fire. So in some cases, fire needs to happen. And then it'll cause nutrients to cycle and recycle. And then you can have that secondary succession where you have like new growth, which can take the place of the old dead things that were there. So fires due to baby showers or baby gender reveal bad. Natural forest fires, that where there's not people around to be hurt. Neutral. I'm not even going to say good. It's a neutral thing. It's a thing that happens in nature. And nature is equipped to deal with it. Do you know how many types of forest there are? It's written up there. It's 3. It's always 3. Tropical, temperate, and cold. So this is usually called northern coniferous or boreal. Can someone edit my videos? I'll give you extra points. All the extra points. So let's take a look at these. So we have our tropical rainforest. Hot, rainy. In fact, these areas are so dense with vegetation that they're not limited by water or temperature. They're limited by light and nutrients because the vegetation up there is so thick. Then we have us. This hopefully looks familiar. Our temperate forest. Yeah, it can get cold. The monthly mean, yes, doesn't go below freezing, but in the winter, yes, we have below freezing days. Where I'm from, where they're like, oh, this is temperate deciduous forest. Yeah, trust me. The mean monthly temperature, this whole thing needs to be shifted down a little bit. And then we have our northern boreal forest, or our coniferous forest, or our taiga. That is my cat. He wants to go outside, and we're not having that. We're not having that, though. There he goes. All right, so tropical rainforest, high temperature, high moisture. When we talk about niches, we'll come back to the tropical rainforest because you see stratification. Now, stratification, when we're talking about rocks or whatever, means layers. So we see sort of like layers of niches. Nutrients need to get recycled very, very quickly because there's so much growth happening. And human activities really impact this area because we've got high biodiversity. So when we wreck up the rainforest, it causes a lot of problems. And so here's just an example of a tropical rainforest. One thing I want to point out, we've got these plants, like this bromelid plant. Here's another one that's growing on another tree. Like they're going to take advantage of any space possible. If they're able to grow there and spread their roots out so they can kind of get the moisture they need and the nutrients they need living on there, they will. Another cool thing is some of these bromelids can like collect water, and this will create little microhabitats for things like the snail or this tree frog. Very cool, very cool. So we'll come back when we talk about niche stratification about how busy and important this is, which is not today. I know, sorry. I know you're so excited about that. Sorry. Okay. Then we have our temperate forest. That's where we live. So it's moderate temperature and rainfall. You see like broadleaf trees. You can look outside and see what I'm talking about. The rate of nutrient recycling is low because they're not usually limited by, that's not necessarily true. Like they are limited by nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, but not to the point that it would stifle growth or require rapid recycling of nutrients. And this is like where we build homes. And these are the forests that we cut down to build that home and build whatever else, and where we cut through to produce roads. So it causes fragmentation of habitats, which is not good. You can look that up and see what I'm talking about. Just look up habitat fragmentation. We'll talk about it later, but you can always look that up now so you have an idea of that going forward. So these should look familiar to you. These things live around us. Hopefully not that right near you right now, but lots of these things. And you can see they're like, you know, the kind of weather we have. So these things are adapted to deal with cold winters and hot summers. Then we have our boreal forest and our taiga. That's like the northern cold, but gets a fair amount of moisture. So it can get very, very cold in the winter. It can get warm in the summer. More rainfall than a desert or a grassland. So you have not that many different plant species, but they're cone-bearing trees, coniferous trees, gymnosperms, like a Christmas tree, a pine tree. Again, the nutrient cycling is low because these things are limited by other factors like temperature or rainfall. On the coast, like in Washington State, I know. I want to say think back, but you guys are probably like very young. I'm just old. I was going to say think back to the Twilight movies. Do people still know what those are? But all the vampires wanted to live in like coastal Washington because they had so few sunny days. Because they're in like basically a temperate rainforest area where it's rainy, and you have lots of growth. So that's our temperate rainforest. And so these are the kind of things you'd see in a coniferous forest. We get these here. So some of these things kind of cross over. Oh, and then let's take a look at our snowshoe hare here. The ears aren't as long and broad as the jackrabbit. Same thing with the legs and feet. They're not as long. They're kind of like tucked in close to the body, and he doesn't look as slim and skinny as the jackrabbit. He looks a little fatter because he's got a thicker coat, probably a layer of fat to store warmth. And the cool thing about the snowshoe hare is when they get their winter coat, it's white to blend in with the snow. How cool that is. That's cool. Science is cool. And here's that temperate rainforest in Washington. So you can see like there's tons of rain, so we've got moss and ferns growing everywhere on everything. So yeah, I think I don't want to talk about mountains today. I think that maybe I'll add that into, for whatever reason, our talk about aquatic biomes. But I feel like this is long enough. So those are the terrestrial biomes. If you have questions about them, just ask. Hopefully that helped you kind of understand them. Really, in summary, you just need to look at the temperature and moisture to get an idea of what biome you might be in, because those are the major factors that define what biome is where. Okay, well, I hope that helped. I know it's not as exciting as my classroom, but I like it. All right, bye.